The galaxy was in chaos, stars flickering like faulty bulbs, explosions painting the void in fiery splashes, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the human was doing what he did best, bluffing his way out of trouble. His ship rattled violently as alien fighters pursued him, their weapons lighting up his console with warning after warning. "Just a routine day," he muttered, hands flying over the controls. "Warning, shields at 2%, his ship's AI announced in its monotone voice. 2% is just spicy 100, he quipped, yanking the stick to veer into an asteroid belt. Behind him, the alien fighters weren't giving up. Not that he blamed them. He'd accidentally stolen what might have been an important artifact. Or, as he preferred to call it, a shiny thing with no owner tag. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, his ship careened around a massive asteroid and into the middle of a galactic battlefield. Ships clashed in a dazzling display of laser fire, and at the center of it all was a colossal cruiser, its design intricate and almost majestic. The human swore under his breath. "Fantastic. More people who want me dead." He didn't have time to process much else before his ship was hit. A direct shot sent him spiraling, alarms blaring as his control panels sparked like overdramatic fireworks. "Brace for impact," he shouted, mostly to himself, since the AI clearly didn't care. The next thing he knew, he was floating. Not in the peaceful, zero-gravity way. More like the, "you're about to get sucked into a cruiser's tractor beam," kind of floating. His battered ship was pulled into the alien vessel, the enormous hangar swallowing him whole. As his cockpit hissed open, he was greeted by a squad of heavily armed aliens, all pointing weapons that looked unnecessarily sharp. "Hi," he said, raising his hands. "I come in peace." Mostly. The aliens didn't respond. Instead, they parted, making way for someone or something. And that's when he saw her. The alien queen. She was tall, her figure draped in an elaborate robe that shimmered like liquid silver. Her features were angular, otherworldly, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that glowed faintly, like the embers of a dying star. She was equal parts intimidating and breathtaking, and the human, ever the opportunist, decided to lean into his natural charm. "Nice ship," he said, flashing a grin. "Big. Regal. Overcompensating for something." The queen raised an eyebrow, at least he thought it was an eyebrow, and gestured for her guards to lower their weapons. "You are the pilot of that wreck?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Technically, yes. But I prefer intrepid adventurer." He took a step forward, ignoring the way her guards tensed. "You know, you've got quite the war zone out there. Very hostile. Almost killed me." "Almost," she echoed, her gaze scrutinizing him. "Yet you survived." "Well, I'm resilient like that," he said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Now, I don't suppose we can skip to the part where I walk out of here alive?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it carried no warmth. "You misunderstand, human. I owe you my thanks." He blinked. "Come again." "The artifact you carelessly pilfered," she began, stepping closer, contained a beacon. Its activation summoned reinforcements at a critical moment, turning the tide of battle in my favor. By pure accident, or reckless stupidity, you have saved my empire. There was a pause as the human processed this. "So, what you're saying is I'm a hero." She tilted her head. "I wouldn't go that far." "I would," he said quickly. "And as a hero, I assume there's some kind of reward? Medal? Key to the galaxy?" Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "There is a custom," she said slowly. "One that dictates I must grant the savior of the empire a single wish." His grin widened. "Now we're talking. Be warned," she added, her tone sharp. "This wish is bound by ancient law. Once granted, it cannot be undone. Choose wisely." The human tapped his chin, pretending to deliberate. "Wealth? Power? A fleet of ships? No. Those weren't his style. Besides, he knew exactly what he wanted." He leaned in slightly, meeting her gaze with an infuriatingly confident smirk. "I wish for you to go on a date with me." The silence that followed was deafening. Her guards shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. One of them stifled what might have been a snort. The queen, however, remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with disbelief. Date. Yep, he said, popping the P. You know, dinner, conversation, maybe some light flirting. Nothing too crazy. You could ask for anything, she said slowly. Wealth beyond measure. Planets at your command. Immortality. Yeah, but where's the fun in that? He replied, shrugging. Besides, how many people can say they've been on a date with the alien queen? She stared at him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether he was incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Finally, she sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose, a surprisingly human gesture. Very well, she said, her voice tinged with exasperation. If this is your wish, then so be it. But let me make one thing clear, human. You will regret this. He grinned. Oh, I doubt that. Her priceless reaction, the faintest hint of a blush creeping into her cheeks, was worth every bit of trouble that was undoubtedly about to follow. The queen regretted agreeing almost immediately. The human, whose name she now knew to be Derek, approached their date with a level of casualness that left her bewildered. While she had spent hours orchestrating every detail, from her attire to the security arrangements, Derek showed up looking like he'd just rolled out of a supply closet. You clean up, surprisingly, she said, her tone hovering between sarcasm and confusion as she eyed his mismatched outfit. Thanks, Your Majesty, he said with a grin. I call it ruggedly approachable. If she hadn't been bound by galactic law, she might have vaporized him on the spot. Instead, she reminded herself to remain composed. This was, after all, a formal arrangement, an absurd one, but still binding. As they entered the designated venue, a neutral space station designed for interspecies gatherings, Derek wasted no time making himself at home. He grabbed a plate of what appeared to be alien hors d'oeuvres and began examining them with exaggerated curiosity. This one looks like it could crawl off my plate, he said, poking a gelatinous blob with his finger. That's a delicacy, the queen replied, her voice sharp. It's revered across 12 star systems. Good to know, he said, popping it into his mouth. His face contorted immediately. Tastes like feet. Are we sure this isn't just bait? Her regal demeanor cracked for a moment as she stifled a laugh. It wasn't the first time she'd heard such a critique of galactic cuisine, but seeing it come from someone so boldly uncultured was oddly refreshing. The conversation, if it could be called that, was no less chaotic. Derek, it seemed, had a habit of filling silences with his own brand of humor. So, Queenie, he said, leaning back in his chair, do you do this often? You know, dining with random humans who crash-land into your empire. Her gaze narrowed. I assure you, this is an unprecedented event. Glad to know I'm special, he said, winking. I mean, not everyone gets to make history over whatever this is. He gestured to his plate, where the gelatinous blob seemed to be congealing further. You're infuriating, she said, but there was no venom in her voice. In fact, to her own astonishment, she found herself enjoying his company. It wasn't the polished banter she was accustomed to with her advisors or diplomats, but it was real. Derek, however, seemed blissfully unaware of the weight of their interaction. He launched into a story about a disastrous first date on Earth, involving a malfunctioning hover scooter and an unfortunate encounter with a flock of geese. The queen listened, equal parts horrified and amused, though she did her best to maintain her stoic expression. And that's why I always say, never trust a bird with a beak that big, he concluded, taking another questionable bite of alien cuisine. Your planet sounds utterly chaotic, she said. Oh, it is, he replied. But it's home. What about you? What's it like being the most powerful person in the galaxy? Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something more vulnerable crossing her features. It is a great responsibility. I bet, he said, his tone uncharacteristically sincere. But doesn't it get lonely? The question caught her off guard. It wasn't the sort of thing anyone dared to ask her, much less someone like him. For a moment, she considered deflecting, but something in his gaze, earnest, curious, and free of ulterior motives, made her pause. Yes, she admitted softly. It does. Derek nodded, as if he understood. Well, if it helps, you're not alone tonight. And for the record, you're doing great. Except for the food. Seriously, who signed off on this? Her laughter, when it came, was quiet but genuine. It surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. You're insufferable, she said, shaking her head. And yet, here we are, he replied, leaning forward slightly. You know, I think this might actually be the best date I've ever been on. Low bar, sure, but still. The queen rolled her eyes, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at her lips. You are truly impossible. Yeah, but I'm fun, he said, raising his glass in a mock toast. To the first, and possibly last, human-alien royal date. She clinked her glass against his, unable to suppress her amusement. It was absurd, ridiculous, and entirely out of character for her. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt human. Or at least she thought as Derek launched into another story, something close to it. The aftermath of their date was nothing short of intergalactic chaos. By the time they returned to the Queen's ship, the galactic media had already caught wind of the event. News of the alien queen dining with a human spread faster than a hyperdrive jump, and the holonet was buzzing with sensational headlines. Alien queen's secret rendezvous with human savior. Love or lunacy? Galactic monarchy at stake over bizarre date. Is the queen planning to abdicate for a Terran romance? The queen, seated in her throne room, glared at the holographic projections of these headlines. Derek, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered as he lounged in a chair, munching on a snack he had pilfered from her royal kitchen. This is a disaster, she muttered, rubbing her temples. My advisors are already drafting apologies to half the galaxy. Apologies? For what? Having impeccable taste, Derek quipped, tossing a piece of alien fruit into his mouth. For fraternizing with you, she snapped. The council believes it compromises my authority. Compromises your— oh, come on. It was just a date, he said, leaning forward. I didn't propose marriage or anything. Not yet, anyway. Her sharp glare softened slightly, though she refused to acknowledge the flicker of amusement that passed through her. You're impossible. And yet, here I am, he said with a grin. Besides, isn't this a good thing? It shows you're relatable. Down to earth. Well, not literally, but you get the idea. She sighed, her gaze shifting to the windows of her ship, where the stars stretched endlessly. Relatable isn't exactly what I aspire to be. Well, maybe it should be, he said, his tone uncharacteristically serious. You spend all this time ruling, strategizing, and making decisions for people who probably never see the real you. What's the point of all that power if you can't just live a little? She stared at him, caught off guard by the weight of his words. For someone who seemed to coast through life on charm and sheer audacity, Derek had an uncanny way of cutting to the heart of things. It was both infuriating and oddly endearing. Before she could respond, a holographic projection of her chief advisor appeared, his expression a mix of panic and exasperation. Your Majesty, the council demands an immediate audience. The situation is escalating. What situation? She asked, her tone icy. The advisor hesitated. There are protests on 3 planets, a formal complaint from the Arcturian delegation, and rumors of a faction plotting a coup. They believe your association with the human is a threat to the stability of the monarchy. Derek raised an eyebrow. Wow. Didn't think I'd cause a revolution on the first date. Guess I'm just that charming. The queen shot him a withering look before turning back to her advisor. Prepare the council chamber. I will address them shortly. The hologram disappeared, leaving them alone once more. She stood, her regal posture returning, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Derek noticed it immediately. Hey, he said, rising to his feet. You've got this. You're the queen, remember? They're lucky you even bothered to listen to them. It's not that simple, she said quietly. Leadership is about more than authority. It's about trust, balance, and perception. If my people lose faith in me— They won't, he interrupted. And if they do, they're idiots. She turned to him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. He stepped closer, his usual playful demeanor replaced by something far more sincere. Look, I get it. You've got an entire galaxy to think about. But don't let them make you feel like you're doing something wrong just because you decided to take a break for once. You deserve that much. For a moment, she simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. You're insufferable, she said softly. But you're not wrong. Story of my life, he replied with a grin. When the Queen entered the council chamber, Derek stayed just out of sight, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He couldn't hear every word of the heated debate that followed, but he could tell from the tone that she wasn't backing down. Every now and then, her voice would rise, cutting through the clamor like a blade, commanding the room with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. By the time she emerged, the tension in her shoulders had eased slightly. Derek straightened as she approached, her expression calm but resolute. Well, he asked. The council has been placated, she said, though her tone suggested it had been far from easy. For now. See? Told you you'd handle it. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. Don't let it go to your head. Too late, he said, falling into step beside her. So what happens now? Do I get exiled? Locked in a dungeon? Or do we go on date number 2? She stopped, turning to face him. You're assuming a lot. It's part of my charm, he said with a wink. She shook her head, but there was no mistaking the hint of amusement in her eyes. Come. There's much to discuss. As they walked down the corridor, Derek couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. Sure, the galaxy might be in uproar and half the universe probably wanted him dead, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And judging by the way the Queen's gaze lingered on him just a moment longer than necessary, he had a feeling she might be starting to feel the same. The Queen was beginning to question her own sanity. This entire ordeal with Derek should have been nothing more than an inconvenience, a small favor repaid to a scrappy human before returning to the serious matters of ruling a galactic empire. Instead, here she was, standing on the observation deck of her flagship, staring out into the vast expanse of space with Derek at her side, his presence equal parts infuriating and oddly comforting. So, he said, breaking the silence, what happens now? Do I get a thank you for your service medal and a pat on the back, or are we just going to keep pretending this was a one-time thing? She turned to him, arching a perfectly sculpted brow. A one-time thing? Yeah, he said with a grin. You know, like those awkward blind dates people go on when they've hit rock bottom. She snorted, an undignified sound that immediately made her straighten, horrified at her lapse in decorum. Derek, of course, noticed and grinned wider. Did you just snort, Your Majesty? He teased. I didn't think royalty even had noses for that. Do not push your luck, human, she replied, though the corners of her mouth betrayed a faint smile. Derek leaned against the railing, his gaze shifting to the stars. You know, this might be the first time I've actually slowed down long enough to look at the view. She studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze taking in the easy confidence he wore like armor. But there was something else there too. Something quieter, hidden beneath his jokes and bravado. Does it not suit you, this slowing down? She asked. He shrugged. Not really my style. I'm more of a crash and burn kind of guy. Literally most of the time. She rolled her eyes. That much is obvious. But, he continued, his tone softening, it's not so bad. When the company's decent, anyway. She felt the faintest flush creep up her neck and immediately chastised herself. This was ridiculous. She was the queen of an entire galactic empire, and here she was, flustered by a human with a penchant for bad jokes and reckless behavior. And you, he asked, turning to face her fully. Do you ever stop? You know, just take a minute to breathe. I do not have that luxury, she said simply. My responsibilities do not allow for indulgence. Maybe they should, he said, his voice quieter now. You can't carry the whole galaxy on your shoulders forever. She wanted to argue, to remind him that her position demanded sacrifice, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she found herself asking a question she hadn't expected. Why did you choose me? He blinked, clearly caught off guard. What? For your wish, she clarified. You could have asked for anything. Wealth, power, your own fleet of ships. But you chose me. Why? He hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. For a moment, she thought he might deflect with another joke, But when he spoke, his voice was uncharacteristically earnest. "Because I figured no one else would." She stared at him, her regal composure slipping as his words sank in. There was no pity in his tone, no condescension, just simple, unvarnished truth. "You spend so much time being the queen," he continued. "I figured maybe you deserved a chance to just be you. Whoever that is." Her throat tightened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was at a loss for words. She had spent centuries surrounded by advisors, diplomats, and leaders who revered her title but never saw her as anything more than a symbol. Derek, infuriatingly, had seen past all of that with a single wish. She cleared her throat, straightening her posture. "You are insufferable." "And yet," he said, his grin returning, "here we are." Before she could respond, her communicator buzzed, interrupting the moment. She answered it with a flick of her wrist, her chief advisor's voice crackling to life. "Your Majesty, the Council has convened. They await your decision regarding the human status." She sighed, the weight of her responsibilities settling back onto her shoulders. "Very well. I will join them shortly." The transmission ended, and she turned back to Derek, who was watching her with a curious expression. "Guess that's my cue," he said, pushing off the railing. "Time to get kicked out of your empire, huh?" "Perhaps," she said, though her tone was far less certain than she intended. As they walked toward the council chamber, an unspoken tension hung between them. Derek, for once, was uncharacteristically quiet, and the queen found herself wishing he would say something, anything, to break the silence. When they reached the chamber doors, she stopped, turning to face him. "Derek," she began, her voice unusually soft. "No matter what happens, know that your presence has been appreciated." He tilted his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're not getting rid of me that easily, Queenie." The doors opened, and the council chamber buzzed with quiet murmurs as they entered. The queen took her place at the center, her gaze sweeping over the assembled advisors. Derek stood off to the side, his hands shoved into his pockets as he watched the proceedings with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. The debate was long and heated, with advisors arguing over the implications of her association with a human. Some called for his immediate exile, while others, surprisingly, argued for leniency. Through it all, the queen remained composed, her voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. In the end, the decision was hers alone. She stood, her gaze steady as she addressed the council. "The human remains under my protection," she declared. "Any further objections will be dealt with accordingly." The chamber fell silent, her words echoing in the air. Derek raised an eyebrow, a slow grin spreading across his face. As they left the chamber, he turned to her, his tone light but his eyes warm. "You just can't resist me, can you?" "Do not mistake this for favoritism," she replied, though the faintest smile played at her lips. Sure, he said, falling into step beside her. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." For the first time in years, the queen found herself looking forward to whatever came next.